So with regard to this, right, labor law, Unit 5, another one was Factory Act, and another, we have like two legislations are there for Unit 5. One is Payment of Wages Act and another one is Factories Act. So Factories Act we have done. Regarding Payment of Wages Act, right, it is a legislation of, and these are the things which are included in the syllabus. Okay, so definition of certain persons like employed person, factory, industrial, other establishments, wages, etc. So these definitions, obviously, whatever is given under the legislation, basically they can ask like what is wage, right? And accordingly, some other question with regard to wages might be there. So few definitions we have. Then we have deductions and then authorities like inspectors are there basically under the legislation. So that is there. Payment of wages, authorities. All right. So this is from Unit 5, which we will be discussing. Okay. So Payment of Wages Act. For any legislation, two dates are important: enacted, when it was enacted, and when it became applicable. Right. So for this legislation also, with regard to date of enactment, it is 23rd of April, and it became applicable from 28th of March 1937, almost like a year later. Why? Because there were so many provisions with regard to like factories, appointments, and all that stuff. Right. So that is the reason why this like time gap is almost like a year. Right. So you need to remember that year is different with regard to when it became applicable 1 year later only, 28th of March 1937. Okay, so that is the first thing with regard to this legislation. Now, regarding applicability in entire India, right, we have seen there are Contract Act and specific relief and other legislations where when it became applicable to Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh only in the year 2018, right, by the Reorganization Act. But with regard to labor laws, what happens is those labor laws were made applicable in Jammu and Kashmir, like most of them under a different legislation. It is the Central Labor Laws Extension to Jammu and Kashmir Act 1970. Just like that Reorganization Act, right? This one is also having like a schedule where list of legislations are given which were made applicable to Jammu and Kashmir in the year 1970 when it was a state, right? So under this legislation in the schedule mentioned, so whatever legislation you are reading, right, you can simply go to that legislation and then look for that legislation's name if it is there or not. So in the year 1970, basically, the scope of Payment of Wages Act was extended and it became applicable to the whole of India, including Jammu and Kashmir, and obviously now like 2 union territories, right? So basically it applies to whole of India, Payment of Wages Act.
Industrial Act also applicable to Jammu and Kashmir?
Yeah. Industrial disputes also. So that is why these legislations we don't get in that 2018 Act, because in 1970 itself, these were made applicable basically.
Okay.
So the Payment of Wages Act 1936 regulates payment of wages to employees, whether direct or indirect. This act is intended to be a remedy against unauthorized deductions made by employer or unjust delay in payment of wages. So Payment of Wages Act basically guarantees payment of wages on time plus without any sort of like deductions which are not allowed under or which are not justified basically, right? So those are the two things. Applicability, it is applicable to the whole of India through the Central Labor Laws Extension to Jammu and Kashmir Act. Its scope was extended again. Are contract workers covered under this legislation? Yes, these provisions are applicable to contract labor employed by any factory or establishment if employment in which they are engaged is otherwise covered under the legislation. If a certain establishment is included under the scope of this legislation, then it does not matter whether employee is engaged on a permanent or a contractual position, it will anyways be applicable. So with regard to this, right, Payment of Wages Act, why this legislation came? Basically because of three reasons. What are those three reasons? Timely payment. Timely payment as in sometimes it might be like, okay, fine, you work this month, but salary will come after 3 months. So those things should not happen. There should be one fixed time, and also these should be fixed, whether it is coming on 1st of every month, 31st of the same month, 7th, 5th, 10th, whatever it is, it should be basically fixed. So first problem that was there is with regard to untimely payment, right? Basically, payment was not received on time. So in order to address that problem, this Payment of Wages Act was introduced. Secondly, permitted deductions. Now, what are deductions basically? Someone may say that if someone is working in somewhere, right, might be they can say that, okay, fine, you have done this thing wrong, you have done that thing wrong, so there will be this deduction, that deduction. And finally, what happens is salary might be 70% of it is deducted, or 90% of it is deducted, and 10% whatever is remaining, you take it. Right? So that also should not happen. There should be something already specified, right? When a person joins, that a person should know what are deductions, what will be permitted deductions, how much will be the deduction. It should not be like when someone is doing something, okay, this much of deduction, right? So permitted deductions, basically we need to know what is allowed and what is not justified. That is another issue. Thirdly, uniformity and payment of wages. So whether are you paying through check, online, offline, how are you paying, all those stuff also should be like, there should be uniformity as well, right? Uniformity with regard to payment of wages, then some salary breakup, whatsoever is there, there should be basically uniformity with regard to all that stuff, right? So Payment of Wages Act 1936, it was introduced in order to address these three issues mainly. Okay, and accordingly, we get provisions regarding these things. So in the objectives also, same thing is written. I have basically tried to make this in our table so that it becomes easier for you to revise. Okay, so there are basically three things. In order to address these three things, Payment of Wages Act was introduced. Regarding this act, what we need to know is when it was enacted, when it became applicable, its scope and applicability, and through which legislations its scope was basically extended. Now, objectives of this regulation, obviously objective will be same only, right? Whatever were the problems that this legislation wanted to address, same are objectives, right? It wants to regulate payment of wages to certain classes of person. It's not applicable to everyone. Why? Because there are some like organized sectors where people are also, like in an ability to negotiate with regard to their salaries and other stuff, right? So in those cases, it's not needed anyways, because employer is already taking care of those things, right? Like if you take example of some companies and all, they are already taking care of those matters, right? Salary will not be paid like 28th or 30th of something, right? Because obviously there is like competition with regard to it around companies. So those things are taken care of. In those cases, it's not needed, right? So with regard to certain classes of person only, this legislation applies, wherein might be employees are not in a position to negotiate with regard to that. So there it wants to regulate payment of wages with regard to them. Then payment of wages on time without any deductions except what is being authorized under this act, responsibility for payment of wages, fixation of wage period, time, mode of payment, permissible deductions, etc. So yes, it says that, okay, fine, on 5th, on 7th, whatever, you need to make the payment. But apart from that, it also like gives responsibility. Who will be responsible in order to ensure it, right? That responsibility is also being fixed under this legislation. You fix a time frame, you fix mode of payment, and also permissible deductions. What is permitted, what is not permitted. That is another objective. Duty to seek approval from government for the acts and permission for which fines may be imposed. If you want to impose fine with regard to certain acts done by the employees, where and all you can actually impose fine, you need to take permission. What will be the amount of fine, how much maximum of fine you can impose, all that also will be applicable.
Suppose if the wages are negotiated through their registered union, then then does payment of wages act is not applicable?
Negotiated through trade union as in?
See, most of the companies will be associated with some of the registered unions, correct? No. So whenever there is a negotiation with respect to wages, so they come into picture, and between employer and employees, so they will negotiate the wages. So here it is regulates the payments a certain persons employed in the industry. So does it mean, is it applicable to all the employees who are workers levels, or if there is no unions who are supporting such an industry?
No, see, there may be an union, but then still they can say that, okay, fine, these are deductions or these are fines that we are doing. So in that case, union is also not that strong, right? So this act basically what it does is it says that these are the basically like industries or areas where this act applies, and it fixes a salary that below this salary, whoever is earning, to them it will apply. So whether they themselves negotiated their wage, it was done through some agency, trade union, does not matter. If it applies to the industry as such, it will apply to the employees also who are earning less than that fixed amount. So who is negotiating, that part would not matter. We would just take into consideration salary of the person plus the industry where the person is working basically. Okay, so for a machinery to hear and decide complaints with regard to deductions, if there were some deductions which might be not permitted on all that stuff. So these are basically objectives of this legislation.